Hello, this talk is going to go over some research into student use of AI in higher education, including some data I've recently published and a new study I just completed where I looked at mental models of what students think AI is and how that relates to their usage of AI. To put it all in perspective, I'll then end with a tour of some other recent studies on how AI might be harming learning or potentially able to help us think and learn better if done right. Now, research into AI is actually quite old, as I did explain more thoroughly in a recent talk on my channel, asking if ChatGPT thinks. But in late 2022, something new blew onto the scene, and that was the public release of a chatbot layered onto OpenAI's GPT 3.5 large language model, or LLM, and from that point onward, none of us could ignore it. It's been described as the fastest growing consumer app in history. Newer versions and other companies' models have been developed and are being integrated into everyday productivity suites, office applications, studying apps, things like that, and indeed being marketed to students heavily on social media, often as a way to cheat on papers and exams, but sometimes as genuine tutors or studying aids. Now imagine being a college student on the first day of a new semester right now. One professor might tell you that using generative AI is cheating, while the next says you'll be using it extensively in their course, and yet another professor doesn't mention it at all. You're told you'll be punished if some mysterious AI detector classifies your work as AI generated. Some professors encourage you to use a grammar app to improve your writing, but others tell you doing that same thing counts as cheating. And at home, maybe one parent worries AI will atrophy your brain, while the other tells you you need to learn prompt engineering to have any hope of landing a job in the new AI-infused economy. Pundits in the media are saying AI makes college obsolete. Social media influencers advertise how to cheat your classes or drop out and start a side hustle with AI. And meanwhile, some of your friends are showing off creative applications of AI that they do for fun, while others might say AI is going to destroy the environment or humanity itself. Whew! If you were a college student, you would probably find yourself a little confused right now, maybe a bit excited or nervous about the new tech, and likely unsure where it fits into your future. And in fact, at the start of this year, I published an article in Teaching of Psychology about a survey of over 700 undergrads on their use of AI and their views about it. And while I don't want to go through all the details from that, I will briefly mention a couple takeaways before diving into a bunch of brand new data for this talk. So in this recent study, I had found that even by late 2023 and early 2024, students were generally familiar with generative AI at that point, and the more familiar they were, the more likely they'd used it to cheat, and also in ambiguous circumstances. Indeed, at the time I found 40% admitted to cheating with AI, and a full 60% had used it in circumstances that were more questionable or ambiguous. And while familiarity with AI predicted excitement about it, it also predicted thinking it's morally acceptable to use AI to cheat. Meanwhile, around 11% reported having been falsely accused of using AI when they hadn't used it, and first-gen students reported false accusations at a higher rate than non-first-gen students. Now, speaking of inequalities, at the time my data was already showing a number of significant and sizable gender differences, with men consistently more involved with AI than women at this point, more excited about it, finding it more relevant to their career, and finding it more morally acceptable to use it in ways that are banned or ambiguous. Now, overall, students leaned nervous more than excited about developments in AI. At the same time, many were already seeing it as relevant to their future career and necessary to learn about in college. Yet, despite the student interest, they reported that most professors were not integrating AI into coursework at all. Meanwhile, the vast majority of students reported a pretty mercenary or pragmatic view of industry. Most students think jobs and industries don't care how you get your work done. They only care about the output. And I think all of these things, the mixed messages, the uncertainty and nervousness, the things they're hearing and thinking about AI and career or AI and inequality, this is leaving a lot of students unsure and needing guidance and clarity from their instructors and institutions. At any rate, if you want more details from that study, I've linked to the free PDF in the video description below. Meanwhile, today I want to share results from a new study I conducted toward the tail end of 2024. One thing that seems to have been neglected in research so far is the mental models that students have of what generative AI actually is. And I think this has major implications for how they'll use it, how they'll trust it, how they'll integrate it into their schoolwork and their lives going forward. So what is generative AI? And what are the large language models that are powering these Gen AI tools that students are seeing and using today? The actual answer, the mechanistic explanation of LLMs, is beyond the scope of this talk, but I would direct anyone interested to walk through 3 Blue 1 Brown's absolutely amazing and accessible introduction to neural networks and LLMs. But for this study, I was more interested in what students thought LLMs were, and that may be less about the actual architecture of neural networks and more about the way this technology is described in the media. And indeed, we've all heard large language models like GPT-4o described with a variety of metaphors. For example, it's an intelligent agent, or a personalized agent, perhaps something with so much agency it'll soon be uncontrollable. It's a tutor, and it'll soon be your doctor, or maybe your therapist. It's reshaping relationships, because it can be a friend, or perhaps even a lover. It's a poet, or an artist, or maybe an unreliable narrator. It's creative, and it can even invent things in these metaphors. Sometimes we attribute mental capacities like thinking to these models, or reasoning, or comprehending meaning, or just plain old learning. And we talk about AI as seeing, hearing, speaking, and understanding what it sees, but also as something capable of having hallucinations, like false perceptions or false beliefs, and maybe having a mind that can be changed. Others describe generative AI, though, as just a tool, or a black box, a mere predictive engine, or glorified autocomplete, a sort of probabilistic parlor trick with no agency or intent. Maybe it's a cognitive enhancer, part of what Clark and Chalmers originally called an extended mind, right? Mental processes comprised of brain, body, tool, and world together. And maybe it's making us cyborgs or centaurs or any number of other metaphors people keep coming up with. So every day, we and our students are seeing generative AI described in ways that have vastly different implications for what it really fundamentally is and what it's capable of, especially in terms of mental capacities. And this got me wondering, does this language we use to describe AI change how, say, students see AI, their mental model of what it really is? In other words, does it affect the folk theory of mind that students have about AI? And if so, does that in turn affect how they use it or intend to use it? Now, before I go further in how I investigated this, a little background on how people tend to think about the mental capacities of other agents. So way back in 2007, Gray and colleagues asked people to rate the relative mental capacities of different types of agents like men and women, fetuses and dead people, chimps and dogs, and even robots. They asked about things like the capacity to feel fear or pain, have personality or consciousness, to demonstrate memory, thought, planning, self-control, morality, and so on. Now, using principal components analysis, they found that all these mental capacity judgments were captured quite well by two overall factors, what they called experience and agency. So they were able to plot on just these two axes a sort of folk theory of mind about all these different agents. So in the upper right, men, women, and yourself are rated high on experience and high on agency, while on average people attributed like high agency to God but no experiencing, or high experiencing to babies but not much agency. Likewise, robots, and again, this is back in 2007, robots were seen as having some agency but no experiencing. Now, other studies have built on this paradigm, for example, looking at individual differences, where people with autism attribute less agency to people, or those with psychopathy attribute less capacity for experience to humans and animals, or those with schizotypy attribute more agency to things like dogs and robots. Now, other research has investigated these attributions for robots that appear, say, more human-like versus those that are more mechanical in appearance, finding that both are attributed equal agency, but the human-looking robot is attributed more capacity for experience, which in turn seems to predict a lot of that uncanny valley phenomenon that people report with human-ish but not quite human agents. Finally, still others have replicated this basic paradigm with some slight twists, including asking participants about a wider variety of mental capacities. So in this 2017 study, for example, while they did replicate the experience and agency factors when they copied Gray's original methodology, when they asked in a more direct and less comparative manner, they actually found 3 distinct factors that all had some elements of experience and agency to those factors. So specifically, they came up with, or their factor analysis came up with bodily and physiological sensations and needs and the self-initiated behavior to address those needs. So it's like, does this agent have the capacity to feel hunger, pain, fear, be conscious and self-aware, that sort of thing? The second factor they found was basically attributions of emotional life and ability to anticipate others' emotions and like the social and moral ramifications of that. So that would be like attributing a capacity to feel embarrassment and joy, to understand others' feelings, self-restraint, telling right from wrong, that sort of thing. And then a third factor they found was perceptual access and cognitive representational abilities, things that sort of influence goal-directed actions. So like remembering, can this thing recognize? Can it smell and hear and perceive depth? Reasoning about things to make choices, that sort of thing. And you can see how these capacities sort of clustered even prior to the factor analysis that identified these 3 overall factors. So for example, looking at staplers, one of these columns here, staplers lack the capacity for bodily experience, the social emotional, and the perceptual cognitive factor, whereas goats have some of all of that, but less than humans. And meanwhile, robots, in the second column here, are granted more of the perceptual cognitive representation domain, but not so much the bodily domain or the social, emotional, and moral domain. That said, this all happened well over half a decade before the earliest ChatGPT came onto the scene, let alone the more impressive models of the last year or so. And asking about a generic robot leaves a lot of room for participants to have very different versions of a robot in mind. So part of the present study that I'm going to be reporting on here is seeing how this all looks now in the era of large language models. Like, what mental capacities do students attribute to, say, ChatGPT? And also, does the metaphor and language we use to describe AI alter this folk theory of mind about LLMs? So to do this, I ran an experiment with 529 undergrads at a state university in late fall of 2024. And so not long after OpenAI released their flagship at the time multimodal ChatGPT 4.0 model. I asked them to rate various mental capacities across 8 characters. So adult female, adult male, deceased person, infant, dog, frog, factory robot, and ChatGPT 4.0. Similar to previous work, each character had a little image, a brief snippet like Sharon Harvey, 38, works at an advertising agency in Chicago, or Charlie is a 3-year-old Springer Spaniel and beloved member of the Graham family. UR-16 is an industrial robot currently used in car assembly lines to help construct new vehicles in a safe, efficient, reliable manner. And finally, for an LLM, I wrote just a fairly neutral description. ChatGPT 4.0 was released by the company OpenAI. Now, for each agent, they answered how capable it is of things like planning, feeling fear, holding beliefs, solving math, remembering, understanding, creativity, and so on. Like the prior studies, I performed a principal component analysis with Verimax rotation, and that yielded a 2-factor solution, where those 2 factors accounted for all of the mental capacities I had asked about and explained 76% of the variance. So I labeled these 2 factors thinking and experiencing, although you can judge the labels for yourself. And as you can see, what I call thinking captured 8 of the 15 mental capacities I asked about. So from highest loading, that's solving math problems, logical reasoning, planning, creativity, understanding, holding beliefs, remembering, and acting immorally. And the second factor, what I call experiencing, captured the other 7 mental capacities we might attribute to something. So from highest loading, that was feeling hunger, feeling fear, feeling pleasure, free will, being persuaded, exercising self-control, and deserving punishment. Now, this is a bit different than Gray et al.'s 2 factors of experience and agency. And in my model, you can see thinking includes some agentic elements like planning, creativity, and acting immorally, but so does experiencing. So there we've got free will, exercising self-control, deserving punishment. And I think maybe the latter kind of agency is more like a feeling of agency, and the former stuff is more agency based on conscious or thought out, planned out choices. I think this makes sense with the non-academic, more colloquial meaning of free will and, just desserts. In other words, feeling free, feeling deserving, feeling like one is or isn't in self-control. At any rate, at least for the 15 mental capacities I asked about, they were captured well by the two factors here that I'm labeling thinking and experiencing. Now, how did the student participants think about the minds of these different targets I asked about? Well, overall, this is where students placed the different types of characters that I asked about. I've mapped it out on thinking and experiencing dimensions. So you can see ChatGPT in the bottom middle, where it falls relative to other agents like humans, dogs, or an assembly line robot that makes cars. If we look at experiencing, ChatGPT was rated by the students as being significantly lower in experiencing than adults and animals, lower than the infant, but not the deceased person or robot. And this was statistically significant, so it was lower than all these. And then when we look at thinking, so the ability of ChatGPT to think in students' minds, it was rated significantly lower than the adults, but significantly higher than the infant, deceased person, frog, dog, and robot. So that gives us kind of a baseline idea of how students see ChatGPT right now. Not really as an experiencing thing, but thinking more than a fairly intelligent animal. Even if it's not yet seen as anywhere near adult human levels of thinking, at least with, students' knowledge of a currently popular and accessible model of LLM like ChatGPT. Now, beyond what mental capacities students are attributing to LLMs, I said I also wanted to know if the language we use to talk about LLMs affects this sort of mental model that people have of AI's capacities. So in this study, I actually embedded an experiment where participants were randomly assigned to see one of 3 invented news articles that I wrote about ChatGPT 4.0's release. In one version, participants saw ChatGPT 4.0 described in rather anthropomorphizing, kind of intelligent agent kind of terms, where it is capable of seeing and hearing, it remembers things, it thinks and reasons to the correct answers. In another version, where most of the story, most of the wording was the same, but some of the framing language was altered, participants saw ChatGPT described in more computational statistical terms, the sort of glorified autocomplete or fancy statistical model metaphor. So here it's not an intelligence, but a large language model. It processes images and audio rather than seeing or hearing. It's trained on statistical associations rather than remembering things, or it calculates rather than thinks and reasons. And I did also have a third, more neutral language kind of condition that minimized both of those framings. And finally, I did actually include a fourth control condition where participants did not see any article at all here, so no prime. And as you can see in the anthropomorphic version up top, ChatGPT was described as a being, as knowing things, as developing common sense, being biased, having hallucinations, and the worries were about it having the sort of agency to maybe take over the world. Whereas in the statistical computational framing in the middle, it's an advanced version of autocomplete that represents patterns, but is just predicting the next word. Rather than being biased, it displays algorithmic bias. It generates wrong answers rather than hallucinating them. And some people worry about its computations rather than its agentic-sounding choices. You get the idea. So that was a manipulation to see if how we frame LLMs like ChatGPT in the media might influence mental models of what AI is and its mental capacities, like thinking and experiencing. And unfortunately, the manipulation here had no significant effect on ratings of ChatGPT's mental capacities, and I found no difference on the thinking factor or the experiencing factor. Those scores were no different for ChatGPT among these groups that people were assigned to. And honestly, that's probably not surprising given how simplistic and blunt the manipulation I did was, but it seems like mental models about LLMs are not easily updated or easily primed by a single exposure to a particular description or framing like this. At any rate, one of my big interests here is in whether students' mental models of AI predict their usage of it. So I also asked some questions about AI usage and views, as well as some basic demographics. So for example, I asked about things like familiarity with Gen AI, use in classes in ways that are explicitly allowed, explicitly banned, or in ambiguous use cases, relevance to future career, necessity as part of college education, intention to use AI in classes going forward, whether they think AI helps or hinders their learning, whether they're more likely to use it for in-person or online classes, demographics like gender, age, and political leaning, as well as measures of both analytic thinking and actively open-minded thinking. Now, the first thing I did was a multiple regression analysis predicting intention to use AI from their rating of ChatGPT's thinking factor, their rating of its experiencing factor that I talked about before, as well as their answers on some of those other questions I just mentioned. And the final regression model predicted intention to use having the following predictors in this order. So educational necessity, their belief that it's necessary to learn this during their education. Career relevance, so if they think it's relevant to their career. ChatGPT's thinking capacity, so the amount they think ChatGPT does think. And their political leaning. So the main predictors of intention to use AI in college classes are thinking it's necessary in your education, thinking it's relevant to your career, thinking that ChatGPT itself is able to think, has thinking capacities, and then rightward political lean. Now, even so, this only predicts about 35% of the variance in intention to use AI in classes, so it might be meaningful, but there's obviously more to their choices than just these factors here. Now, finally, I did some very simple exploratory analyses, but just to conservatively correct for multiple comparisons, I'm only going to describe as significant any results that have a p-value below 0.001, so 50 times more strict than the conventional cutoff for statistical significance. Now, first off, the only strong gender difference I found this time was men significantly more likely to think AI is relevant to their future career. As I mentioned earlier, I had also found this in my previous larger survey where men were consistently more invested in and experienced with generative AI across the board. More generally, those who attributed more thinking capacity to ChatGPT reported more career relevance for AI, more thinking that AI training is necessary in college, and as we just saw, more intention to use it in their courses going forward. So perhaps one of the big takeaways here is that as students perceive LLMs to be gaining in thinking capacities, they are more likely to use those LLMs in their schoolwork. And just a side note, but in this study, 60% of students admitted to cheating with AI, admitted that they had used AI in circumstances explicitly banned by professor or policy. And again, this is up from 40% when I asked the same question of a nearly identical sample a year prior. And meanwhile, more students are now leaning, although just barely, toward thinking that AI helps their learning more than it hinders their learning. And finally, perhaps not surprisingly, many students say they are more likely to use AI in online courses than in-person courses, although most students report they're equally likely to use it in either type of course. Now, at the end here, I want to just briefly move beyond my own results and put things in the context of some relevant work coming out of other labs recently. Like this study in Germany, where they randomly assigned college students to spend 20 minutes looking into a contentious issue, whether nanoparticles in sunscreen should be used, and the students were assigned to either use web search on Google or to use ChatGPT, and then the students gave a recommendation about this topic and their reasoning for it. So the study found that students who had used AI for their research, for kind of the learning before their recommendation, had lower cognitive load during that task. But they also gave lower quality justifications for their recommendation at the end when they were writing that without ChatGPT or Google. Basically, the task was easier when they had AI, when they were using that versus web search, but that led to lower quality reasoning and argumentation by the students later. And specifically, they found that the effect of task on performance was mediated by germane cognitive load, which is basically working memory and attentional resources dedicated to acquiring or updating your schemas and understanding. So using ChatGPT instead of traditional search had lower germane cognitive load, lower of that more meaningful, active, effortful processing, and that was a mediator that explained why argumentation was worse in the AI group later. They had less cognitive burden during the AI condition, like during that research, and that seemed to lead to worse reasoning when they were talking about the topic later. So a takeaway might be that if you have students use AI, they need to be guided to use it in a more active and mentally effortful way. Another recent study tested an intervention with around 1,000 high school students in Turkey using ChatGPT as a math tutor. The students had 4 math review sessions throughout their semester, just going over math material learned so far, where in these sessions the teacher did a mini lecture and then the students spent time doing practice questions. And they were randomized to either do them normally with pen and paper, or use a basic standard version of ChatGPT, or a more tutor-focused version of ChatGPT that had a system prompt behind the scenes such that it knew the practice problems and their answers, it knew the most common mistakes according to the teachers, but it was instructed to give hints but not reveal the answer. So during these review sessions, these 4 review sessions, those in the GPT tutor condition did the best, and those with the base version of ChatGPT still did better than those without AI access. But that's when they have the computer there to answer the review questions. What happens when they actually have to take a test later without AI access? Well, kind of worryingly, the researchers found that those who had used GPT-base to study actually did worse on the exam than the no AI group. But they didn't perceive that they had done worse. And those in the GPT tutor group, even for this special learning protective version of AI, did no better on the later exam than the no AI group. But they mistakenly thought they had performed significantly better. So using AI for studying might lead to metacognitive errors and a false sense of mastery, and instructors may want to address these metacognitive issues with students directly. But another takeaway is that custom AI interfaces are at least more promising to mitigate the downsides of poor or naive use of these tools than the default interface. And yet another recent study that I think is relevant is this one where the researchers set up a simulated AI chatbot that was available while participants solved some non-verbal reasoning puzzles in a time crunch situation of 45 seconds per puzzle. So if the participant chose to use Cogbot, in one condition it would give an explanation to tell them how to solve the puzzle, whereas in another condition, Cogbot just gave them the answer. And in a final third condition, it gave both the explanation and the answer. And what did the study find? Well, when the simulated AI here gave the answer, whether it also included the explanation or not, if it just gave the answer, the participants relied more on Cogbot. Basically, when it's available, we will take the shortcut, just take the answer, for efficiency's sake. And then in a second experiment, participants got both the answer and the explanation, but they tested if the order mattered. And there they found that the people seeing the answer first did better initially and showed more reliance on the bot. I mean, why not? It's helpful and efficient, right? And the answer is right there. But then in transfer trials at the end, Cogbot actually gave wrong answers and explanation. So I like this design. There's some transfer trials where suddenly the AI is not so correct. And sure enough, those who had previously relied on it more heavily did worse now when Cogbot gave wrong answers. And that answer first group actually performed worse than those who had seen explanations before seeing the answer. So a takeaway here might be that it'll be easy for students, and honestly all of us, to become reliant on AI and to trust its output when it's correct a lot. But that also breeds complacency, and it makes us less likely to catch on and think critically when the AI happens to offer errors or is overly confident in topics where there isn't a clear right answer. Meanwhile, there's a recent mixed method study by Gerlich looking at social media users who were recruited in the UK, and he found that higher AI usage was strongly correlated with lower critical thinking abilities. And this was mediated by a greater tendency toward cognitive offloading, or relying on technological tools to do your thinking. Like a stereotypical example would be pulling out your phone calculator to figure out the tip at a restaurant instead of doing it in your head. Now, these results don't show causation, obviously. The author suggests the possibility that a tendency to automate routine cognitive tasks might undermine cognitive engagement and practice with cognitively demanding tasks, and that this lack of practice might erode critical thinking skills. Personally, that seems like a big stretch to me, at least from this cross-sectional correlational data. So I'd much rather see a study manipulating AI usage or AI offloading and see if it changes, more state-level critical thinking rather than looking for these trait-level differences. In other words, does a tool like AI, or maybe a particular interface or use of it, does that lead to more reliance on System 1 thinking? And can we design AI interfaces in a way that actually prod System 2 analytical thinking? That's one area I'm looking at next. Can AI be used to actually bolster critical thinking for students? And I'm surprisingly hopeful that it's at least possible. After all, we're also getting studies like this recent Science article from Costello working with the Pennycook and Rand group. They had thousands of Americans articulate a conspiracy theory they believed, and then had participants converse with, in this case, GPT-4 Turbo, which had been set up with a system prompt to respond to the participants' argumentation and their evidence while trying to reduce belief in the conspiracy theory. And they found that this did in fact reduce conspiracy belief by around 20% in a way that lasted for multiple months afterward. And this worked for a wide variety of conspiracy theories like JFK's assassination, the Illuminati, aliens, you name it. It also made people less likely to believe other conspiracies. And thankfully, for true conspiracies, the AI didn't reduce belief. And they professionally fact-checked the transcripts, showed that the AI made no false claims, according to the transcripts, and next to no misleading claims, according to professional fact-checking. And while this is a little different than prompting students to think critically in their own coursework, I think this is the sort of thing that gives us a little peek into the possibilities where conversing with a large language model, especially more advanced frontier models with improved reasoning, like OpenAI's recent O1 model or their upcoming O3 model, it might be leveraged to help people think through their beliefs more critically. And it remains to be seen if this is the kind of thing that could be skilled up with an AI and have lasting critical thinking benefits outside of the AI usage, or if it's more like the studies I talked about first, where AI might do the mental heavy lifting for us and it could actually backfire when the AI isn't there to help us think. And I'll close on that thought. One thing we know from pedagogical research and the scholarship of teaching and learning is that doing hard, effortful mental lifting is essential to building a robust ability to think and perform. I often tell my students now that college is like a really expensive gym membership that you pay out the ass for. You are doing it to build your muscles. But in the case of college, the muscle would be your brain. You are paying a lot to build your brain up stronger, gaining not just knowledge, but skills and the ability to do harder and more complex things. And just like a gym, that takes practice, practice, practice. It means putting in real effortful work, even when it's hard and a little painful and you're tired because of all the other stuff going on in your life. But if you're using AI to do all the heavy lifting for you, then you're going to realize at some point that your own muscles, your own brain, atrophied away, and now you're weaker than ever. So I tell my students the reason you're learning and writing and doing things in your education is not because it's essential to remember all the facts that you're tested on, or because your professors are dying to read 100 of the same essay. We are your personal trainers, and we're just trying to help you do your own heavy lifting so that you come out with big muscles. And at this point, we already know a robot can lift a lot more weight than a human, and I know ChatGPT can crank out a decent paper, but that stuff's not really helpful for the goal of us as professors being your personal trainer, to build your muscles, to build your brain. So anyway, that's the metaphor and sort of pep talk I've been using to get my students thinking metacognitively about how they use AI and how it'll affect their own abilities. And maybe in a future talk I'll have some data on whether that kind of framing changes how they intend to use AI in school. And likewise, maybe future work can use things like this theory of mind paradigm I talked about to study how mental models of LLMs are changing over time or differ for various groups. I'm also doing some work right now investigating AI alignment, like how AIs are designed in a way that aligns with various human values, and how that changes things like the role students see AI playing in their learning, and also in other aspects of their life like social media and the information ecosystem. So check back later this year for more data, though by then we'll likely be dealing with AI agents, controlling someone's entire browser or computer system to do tasks for them. And hopefully AI alignment will be a little less of a Wild West frontier at that point. Thank you for watching, and if you like this talk, it would mean the world to me if you hit the like button.